Laura Bennett wiped her hands on her apron and glanced out the kitchen window at the steady drizzle falling across her small Oregon backyard. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, and she felt the familiar mix of relief and loneliness that came every time Ethan, her son, was home from college. Ethan had been visiting with his best friend, Daniel Harper, for only a few days, but already the presence of the tall, polite young man made the house feel different, warmer, somehow fuller. Laura had known Daniel since he was a teenager, the kind of quiet, dependable friend any parent would trust with their child, and she always appreciated his manners, the way he helped set the table, carried groceries without being asked, and laughed easily at Ethan's jokes without ever trying to compete for attention. She shook her head slightly, reminding herself to stay practical. He was Ethan's friend, just a guest in her home. Yet there was something in the way Daniel moved through the kitchen, offering to make her tea or asking if she needed help carrying plates to the dining table, that made her heart beat a little faster without reason. That Sunday evening, she was rinsing dishes and trying not to dwell on thoughts that seemed to spring up without warning when Daniel's voice broke the quiet, calm and gentle, carrying a hint of hesitation that made her pause. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, and she turned toward him, raising her eyebrows in polite curiosity. "Would it be okay if I stayed a little longer? Just a few more weeks." Her hand froze on the sponge, a drop of soapy water slipping into the sink as she blinked at him, startled by the request. It was a simple question, the kind a parent might expect from any guest, but there was an unexpected weight behind it, a sincerity that made her pause. Laura had not anticipated it, not at all. She looked at him, his eyes steady, honest, and for a moment, the room felt charged, as though the quiet rain outside had paused to listen too. She wanted to say no, to remind herself that it was just a visit and that feelings like these, new, fluttering emotions, were not meant for someone her age, someone in her position. Yet, when she opened her mouth, all she could manage was a soft nod, a wordless agreement that surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. Daniel smiled faintly, not triumphantly, but with relief, and Laura felt a strange warmth in her chest, a mix of apprehension and curiosity. Ethan was out for a short walk, phone pressed to his ear, oblivious to the moment unfolding at home, and the house, usually familiar, felt somehow different, almost expectant. She returned to the sink, rinsing the dishes, trying to focus on the mundane task, but her mind kept drifting back to Daniel's face, his calm voice, the honesty in his request, and she realized she had noticed him more in the past few days than she had expected, how he laughed quietly when she teased Ethan, how he lingered politely when conversation fell, how he seemed to understand without needing explanation. It was a subtle tension, easy to miss, but now, with his request lingering in the air, she felt it sharply. Her fingers scrubbed the plates faster, as if the motion could keep her mind from wandering into dangerous territory, but it was impossible to ignore. She had spent years focused on raising Ethan, keeping their home organized, managing grief after her husband passed, and she thought she was immune to these kinds of feelings, immune to sudden stirrings of connection, yet here it was, undeniable. The request, so innocent in words, felt profound in effect, and she realized that the coming weeks would be different, that Daniel's presence might shift more than just the schedule of the house. She reminded herself firmly, he was her son's friend. Nothing more. That thought was meant to anchor her, yet it did little to calm the fluttering in her chest. She straightened, walked toward the table, trying to compose herself, and Daniel, sensing no immediate objection, began clearing the counter quietly, his movements careful and attentive. The rain outside picked up, drumming against the windows, and in that soft, rhythmic sound, Laura felt a strange comfort, a signal that the house could hold more than loneliness, that perhaps life still had room for small surprises, for connections she had not anticipated. She poured herself a cup of tea, hands trembling slightly, and sat down at the table, catching herself glancing at Daniel again. He was polite, careful, respectful, but his presence was now layered with something unspoken, something that pulled at her attention despite all the reasons she had to ignore it. She reminded herself that nothing had changed, that he was just a guest, that the house was still hers to run, yet she knew instinctively that the coming days would test the boundaries she had drawn for herself. The storm outside mirrored the quiet storm inside her heart, calm on the surface but alive beneath, moving in rhythms she could not predict. The kitchen, the dishes, the warm steam rising from her tea, all these familiar things suddenly felt like the backdrop for something new, a story she had not expected to live. Laura sipped her tea slowly, listening to the rain, aware of Daniel's soft footsteps behind her as he moved about the kitchen, and realized that life had a way of surprising people when they thought they were settled, when they believed the past had defined all the possibilities. The air between them was charged, not with words or declarations, but with the subtle recognition that something unspoken had begun, something that might grow if given time, if nurtured with patience and care. She looked at him again, and he met her gaze, a faint smile playing on his lips, understanding perhaps that her heart had just shifted, even if she refused to admit it aloud. Ethan returned a few moments later, phone call ended, laughter in his voice, unaware of the quiet tension that had settled like a soft shadow over the kitchen. Laura felt a pang of guilt and excitement all at once, emotions she had thought were long buried, and she realized with a start that Daniel's question, so simple, so ordinary, had opened a door she hadn't expected to find. It was just a request to stay longer, just a few more weeks, but it carried with it a promise of something undefined, something that could change the pattern of her quiet life. She set her cup down, heart still beating faster than usual, and forced a small smile as she greeted Ethan, careful to hide the new, complicated feelings swirling beneath the surface. As the evening wore on, the rain continued to fall, and Laura found herself stealing glances at Daniel, noticing the easy way he moved, the way he seemed comfortable in her home, the way the ordinary moment of being asked to stay had shifted the rhythm of her thoughts. It was, she realized, the beginning of an unexpected chapter, and even though she had no idea where it might lead, she knew she could not ignore it, could not turn away from the quiet pull she felt toward him. And so, as the night deepened and the lights of the house reflected softly against the windows misted with rain, Laura sat at the kitchen table, tea cooling in her hands, and listened to the sound of water dripping outside, feeling, for the first time in years, the strange thrill of anticipation. The days stretched quietly, soft and slow at first, yet under the surface, something shifted in ways Laura hadn't anticipated. Daniel's presence in the house became more than just a friend staying over. It became a rhythm she felt in her chest, a subtle warmth that followed her from the kitchen to the living room and even into the small study where she spent her afternoons grading papers and organizing her home library, and she noticed, with a mixture of surprise and hesitation, how easy it was to talk to him, how natural it felt to share thoughts she hadn't voiced in years, small confessions about the loneliness after her husband passed, the quiet ache of missing him even while trying to keep life moving, the frustration of feeling invisible in a world that expected her to simply carry on. Daniel never interrupted, never judged, he simply listened, his quiet attentiveness making her words feel important again, and she realized that this was a feeling she had almost forgotten, being seen, truly seen, by someone who respected her and valued her presence, and the small domestic moments of him helping around the house, fixing the leaky faucet, folding laundry without being asked, cooking simple dinners when she was too tired to think about food, all of it became layered with something tender, something that made her heart skip in ways she tried not to notice, especially when he laughed softly at Ethan's jokes or offered a kind word when she mentioned a challenge at work, and even though she reminded herself daily that he was her son's friend and boundaries mattered, the truth was unavoidable. She found herself thinking of him when he wasn't around, wondering what he was doing. Missing the quiet companionship of his presence, and she noticed a strange restlessness in the house when he stepped out for errands or a walk, as if the walls themselves had grown accustomed to the calm energy he brought. Ethan was mostly unaware, caught up in his own world, but he occasionally remarked on the difference in the house, saying things like, "Mom, it feels lighter here with Daniel around," and though Laura brushed it off with a smile, there was a flutter of acknowledgement inside her that she couldn't dismiss. She had started looking forward to small gestures, the way Daniel asked about her day before heading to the garage, the way he made her tea exactly how she liked it, the way his presence filled spaces she had long treated as empty, and even when they shared moments of silence, working side by side in the kitchen or sitting in the living room reading, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a gentle companionship that felt almost sacred, and she caught herself noticing details, the way his eyes softened when he laughed, the subtle tension in his shoulders when he was deep in thought, The warmth in his smile that seemed to linger longer than politeness required, and she realized that it wasn't just comfort she felt, it was longing, quiet but undeniable, a recognition that her heart was waking again, even in ways she tried not to name. Yet Laura remained careful, keeping distance when necessary, reminding herself that Daniel's place was with Ethan, that she could not act on feelings that were complicated, that could risk her son's trust or the safe rhythm of their family. She maintained her composure, even as her thoughts betrayed her, wandering to possibilities she had almost believed were close to her forever, and she found herself walking through the garden at dusk, imagining conversations and moments that had yet to happen, feeling the stirrings of hope mixed with guilt, delight mixed with fear, and in those quiet walks, she noticed how Daniel's shadow sometimes lingered on the porch, waiting to help her bring in chairs or carry groceries, how his laughter floated down the hall from Ethan's room, and how the simple act of having him nearby created a sense of anticipation, a secret joy she had never thought she could feel again. Small interactions, like sharing coffee in the morning or laughing at a minor mishap in the kitchen, became charged with more than they appeared to be, and Laura found herself staying up later than usual, thinking over fleeting touches of hands, the way Daniel would hand her a towel or pass her a plate, wondering why ordinary kindness now felt like something more, something delicate and thrilling, and yet she never allowed herself to cross a line, never allowed the words to form aloud that might change everything, because she understood the stakes. She knew Ethan's happiness, the trust between them, and the fragile peace of their home was more important than the stirrings of a heart that had been asleep for so long. And still, the days went by, and every small gesture, every conversation, every quiet moment shared over cooking, cleaning, or reading, carried weight, carrying a kind of unspoken intimacy that neither of them could entirely name, and Laura realized that these weeks with Daniel had become something she depended on, something she treasured, as if his presence had become a balm to her lonely spaces, filling them with a warmth that was both comforting and terrifying because it reminded her how much she had closed herself off after loss. She noticed how Daniel seemed to anticipate her moods, offering a word of encouragement or a playful comment just when she needed it, and she found herself laughing more easily, her steps lighter, her evenings filled with a calm she hadn't felt since before her husband died, and in the quiet of those evenings, when Ethan was asleep or out with friends, she would sometimes catch herself staring at the empty spaces he would soon occupy, imagining him sitting across from her at the table, talking softly, and her chest would ache slightly with the unspoken desire for more than friendship, yet she quickly reined in those thoughts, remembering the line she could not cross. But life has a way of slipping into moments that catch people unprepared, and Laura felt, in the quiet tension of shared meals, in the lingering conversations, in the comfort of shared silence, that something was building between them, something tender, something alive that was quietly reshaping the contours of her heart. She would often wake in the morning and find Daniel already moving quietly around the kitchen, preparing coffee, his presence unobtrusive yet profoundly grounding, and she realized that she had begun to notice him in ways that were different from how she noticed guests or even friends, that the rhythm of their days had created a kind of intimacy that was innocent but deeply affecting, and she felt an unfamiliar combination of excitement and fear every time their eyes met across the kitchen table or the living room sofa. And so, the days continued, moving with the gentle pulse of summer afternoons, warm, lingering, filled with light showers, the scent of damp grass, and quiet moments in the garden, while Laura felt herself being drawn to Daniel not through anything dramatic, but through the steady, calm, gentle insistence of his presence, a presence that made ordinary life feel extraordinary, and she found herself laughing more, sharing more, and feeling more alive than she had in years, all while holding back the deeper feelings she dared not name aloud, knowing that the next chapter of their story, whatever it might be, was waiting quietly on the horizon, and she could only wonder if it would bring joy, complication, or heartbreak, but even so, she cherished each small day, each quiet smile, each fleeting glance, knowing that in this slow unfolding, she was waking up to a world that had once seemed close to her, a world where connection, hope, and perhaps even love could exist again. The storm hit unexpectedly, a sudden wall of wind and rain that rattled the windows and sent shadows dancing across the walls of the Bennett house, and Laura found herself standing by the front window, gripping the sill as the trees bent under the force, heart beating in rhythm with the weather outside, while the familiar hum of the refrigerator and soft tick of the clock seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the sound of rain and the quiet tension building inside her. Ethan had been called into work unexpectedly, leaving the house to Laura and Daniel alone for the first time since his extended stay, and she felt a strange mixture of relief and nervous anticipation that made her palms clammy, because while they had grown close over the past weeks, sharing conversations and quiet domestic routines, this was different. This was unplanned, private, and charged with an intimacy they had both felt but never addressed, a delicate tension that had grown from shared smiles, soft laughter, lingering glances, and small acts of care, and Laura was suddenly very aware of Daniel's presence as he moved across the kitchen to adjust the candles on the table, his hand steady, deliberate, his calm voice cutting through the noise of the storm with a quiet authority that made her pulse quicken. "It's really coming down out there," he said, glancing toward her with a gentle smile, and she nodded, unable to speak, feeling as if the simple exchange carried more meaning than either of them dared to acknowledge, because the weeks of shared afternoons and quiet evenings had built something fragile yet undeniable, a connection that went beyond friendliness, beyond comfort, into territory neither of them had expected to explore, and as the wind howled outside, she felt herself leaning into the warmth of the living room, aware of the way his presence filled the space around her, making the room feel smaller, closer, more intimate, while her mind raced with thoughts she tried not to voice. Daniel moved to the couch and sat down, careful to maintain distance, yet there was a tension in the air, a pull that neither could ignore, and finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them longer than either could admit, he spoke softly, almost a whisper over the wind and rain. "I didn't ask to stay longer because I had nowhere else to go," he said, eyes meeting hers, steady and sincere. "I stayed because this house, this family, feels like home. Because you make it feel that way." The words struck her like lightning, and for a moment, she felt her heart stop, the storm outside mimicking the sudden rush of emotion she could barely contain. She wanted to speak, to tell him that she felt the same, that his presence had become more than comfort, that she had been quietly longing for something she had thought impossible after her loss, yet the words seemed trapped in her throat, heavy with fear, guilt, and the thrill of forbidden emotion, and so she simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement that somehow communicated everything she couldn't say, while he understood without explanation, his gaze softening, patient, respectful, but charged with the unspoken acknowledgement of what had been growing between them for weeks. Laura felt the tension in her chest, a mixture of desire and hesitation, a recognition that their connection was real and fragile at the same time, and yet she could not, would not, cross the line that would betray her son or the careful trust she had worked so hard to maintain, and so they sat, side by side but not touching, sharing silence that was louder than words, listening to the storm, letting the rain and wind wrap around the house like a shield that allowed them a private moment, a space where feelings could exist without consequence, where honesty could breathe without judgment, and she noticed, with a clarity that startled her, how much she depended on his calm, how much his presence made the world outside the storm fade away, leaving only the two of them, alive in the quiet intensity of mutual understanding. He shifted slightly, closer, but not too close, his hand brushing against the edge of the armrest where hers had been moments before, a deliberate, cautious touch that sent a shiver through her, and she realized that neither of them needed words. The acknowledgement of longing, of emotion, was enough to create a bond that felt dangerous yet safe at the same time, thrilling yet grounded, something she had not known she needed until now, and she found herself thinking of all the small ways he had become part of her life over the weeks, the quiet mornings, the shared meals, the easy conversations, the way he had listened without judgment, the way he had made her feel seen, and understanding that this stormy night was the culmination of that slow, gentle build, a night where emotions could no longer be hidden, where the truth had to be faced, even without promises or decisions, because honesty had a way of breaking through fear and hesitation. The rain fell harder, drumming against the roof, lightning flashing briefly through the windows, illuminating Daniel's face and showing her the sincerity, the gentleness, and the quiet longing mirrored in his eyes, and she felt herself responding in ways she hadn't anticipated, chest tightening, heart racing, mind aware of every small gesture, every nuance of tone, every fleeting glance, and she knew, with a sudden clarity, that she had allowed herself to care again, that she had opened the door to emotion she thought was closed forever, and it both thrilled and terrified her. No dramatic declarations were made, no confessions that could complicate everything, yet in that silence, in the storm, in the private understanding between them, Laura felt something monumental shift, a recognition that their connection was real, meaningful, and worth acknowledging, even if it remained unspoken, even if the boundaries of family and friendship required patience, restraint, and careful navigation, and she realized that the weeks ahead could be full of possibility, that the relationship they were forming was delicate, yet vital, a source of quiet hope that could sustain her in ways she hadn't expected. The storm raged on, wind rattling the windows, rain drenching the garden outside, while inside the house, Laura and Daniel sat together in that charged stillness, aware of each other's presence, hearts quietly beating in sync with the rhythm of the storm, understanding, without speaking aloud, that something had changed forever, that a door had opened, and that even the smallest acts, the softest words, the gentlest glances, could now carry meaning beyond friendship, carrying the promise of connection, comfort, and perhaps, in time, love. And as the hours passed and the storm began to calm, she realized that she would remember this night always, not for fireworks or dramatic gestures, but for the quiet honesty of emotion, for the courage to acknowledge what she felt, for the shared understanding that sometimes, life surprises people in ways they never imagine, and that those surprises, when handled with care and patience, can lead to a future that is tender, meaningful, and full of the hope she had almost forgotten existed. The day Daniel left arrived quietly, without fanfare, a soft early morning where the sun barely lit the edges of the clouds, and Laura felt a strange mix of anticipation and emptiness as she watched him pack his bag in the guest room, the familiar rhythm of his presence that had become a steady comfort over weeks now preparing to vanish, leaving the house quieter, lighter, and yet strangely hollow. Ethan had come down for breakfast, sleepy-eyed and cheerful, unaware of the storm of emotion swirling in his mother's chest, chatting casually with Daniel about his next college semester and laughing at inside jokes Laura barely understood, while she sat at the kitchen table, holding her cup of coffee and trying to steady her thoughts, knowing that the goodbye would be more than a simple farewell, that it carried the weight of everything that had passed between them, the quiet afternoons of conversation, the shared meals, the way his presence had slowly become an anchor in her life, a reminder that the world still had room for joy, companionship, and even love. Daniel moved around with his usual careful politeness, double-checking that he hadn't forgotten anything, and every small gesture, every glance, seemed amplified in significance, the mundane actions now loaded with meaning because she knew she would miss them, would miss him, and even as she reminded herself that boundaries mattered, that he was her son's friend and a young man with his own life to lead, she could not help but feel a deep ache, a longing that made her chest tighten and her eyes sting slightly, and when he finally approached her, backpack slung over one shoulder, he paused and gave her a soft, measured smile, the kind of smile that conveyed gratitude, affection, and unspoken understanding all at once, and she realized with a jolt that she would remember this moment forever, a quiet, tender snapshot of connection that was both thrilling and bittersweet. "Thank you for everything," he said, voice low, almost reverent, and Laura found herself swallowing hard, nodding, words caught in her throat because how could she possibly explain months of subtle intimacy, shared laughter, stolen glances, and emotional healing in a single phrase, when all she wanted was to say more, to tell him that his presence had changed her life in ways she hadn't imagined, yet she restrained herself, knowing that this goodbye had to be respectful, that the path forward required patience and care. Ethan stepped forward, clapping Daniel on the back with a cheerful, "See you soon, man. Don't forget to write," and Laura smiled, the corners of her mouth lifting despite the ache in her heart, because even as she felt the weight of the empty space Daniel would leave, she realized that the love and care he had shown, the quiet companionship that had grown into something deeper, had left an imprint that could not be erased, and as he hugged Ethan tightly, then turned to offer her a gentle, brief embrace, she felt the subtle electricity of connection, the warmth that lingered long after he pulled away, and she knew that this was not an ending, but the start of a new phase where feelings, patience, and honest communication could guide whatever came next. The house felt strange afterward, the silence stretching across the rooms where his laughter and presence had filled corners with light and warmth, and Laura walked from room to room, noticing how empty everything seemed, yet also noticing the lingering traces of his care, dishes left washed, books returned to their places, Small notes he had left behind with gentle humor, reminders of his thoughtfulness, and she felt a tender mix of sadness and gratitude, understanding that even absence could carry meaning, that his impact on her life would remain long after he had gone. Weeks passed, and their communication became careful, measured, a string of messages, emails, and phone calls that allowed them to maintain connection without rushing the delicate balance of emotion, and Laura felt herself growing stronger, more confident in her ability to acknowledge her feelings while maintaining respect for boundaries, while Daniel's voice over the phone could still make her heart flutter, his words still comforting her on days when loneliness crept in, and she realized that the months of his stay had been a lesson in subtle intimacy, patience, and the quiet strength of unspoken understanding. A lesson that allowed her to reconnect with emotions she had buried and to see that life, even after grief and solitude, could offer moments of joy, companionship, and perhaps love. And one afternoon, months later, Daniel returned for a weekend visit, not as a guest, but as someone whose presence had become welcome and anticipated, and Ethan, older, wiser, and perceptive beyond his years, simply smiled knowingly at his mother, saying softly, "You both deserve this," and Laura felt tears prick her eyes, a mixture of relief, happiness, and a gentle thrill at the recognition that the careful patience, honesty, and mutual respect that had guided their relationship had created space for something real, meaningful, and lasting, a connection that honored the past while allowing the future to unfold naturally, without force, without drama, but with a steady, tender devotion that promised growth and understanding. That weekend was filled with laughter, quiet conversations, long walks, and moments where a hand brushed a shoulder, a glance lingered, a smile conveyed more than words ever could, and Laura realized fully that the surprise she had first felt when Daniel asked to stay longer had been just the beginning, the opening of a door to emotions and possibilities she had never imagined possible in her life again, and she understood, as she watched him helping Ethan with a small project in the garage, then turning to offer her a reassuring smile, that love could emerge in the quietest of ways, that healing could come through patient care and emotional honesty, and that life, even after loss, could surprise a person with something gentle, meaningful, and enduring, something that neither rushed nor demanded, but grew naturally, beautifully, and irrevocably. And as the weekend drew to a close, Laura felt a calm she had never known before, a certainty that whatever happened, the bond they had formed, based on respect, care, and quiet love, would endure, that the house would always hold traces of the warmth Daniel had brought, that her heart had been opened again, carefully and tenderly, to the possibility of love, and that she was ready to embrace whatever the future might hold, with hope, patience, and the knowledge that true connection, when nurtured with honesty and understanding, could bring light into the quietest corners of life, leaving her with the gentle realization that some surprises, the ones that touch the heart and soul, are meant to be savored, remembered, and cherished, because they remind a person that life is never truly finished with joy, that love can appear when least expected, and that the courage to feel again is the most beautiful gift of all.